The Macabre World podcast is brought to you by Darker Art Studio, home of real human bone jewelry. Stock and custom pieces are available, so visit us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com and show them your darker art side. Macabre World, a podcast from Darker Art Studio, where we explore the dark, strange, and unusual from this world and beyond. Hello and welcome to the Macabre World podcast. My name is Rocky Digati, and here with me today is Martin Keller. Martin Keller is the author of the Space Pen Club, and you can see his stuff and order his book at thespacepenclub.com because it'll take you right to Amazon via button. Martin, thank you for joining us. Now, do we call you a ufologist?
No.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
I'm a lifelong observer of this topic, and I guess I'm also an experiencer. But what I am an experiencer of is still to be determined, and that's one of the narrative threads in the Space Pen Club book.
And I have to tell folks, you were kind enough to send me a copy, and I was reading, and the tone of this book is very conversational. It's very anecdotal. It's interesting. It's written in styles of vignettes. It's an enjoyable read. It's not all sci-fi tech stuff.
No, I don't think you want sci-fi in a UFO discussion. There's enough garbage in the field of ufology to begin with. We don't need to drag in any sort of window dressing that has anything to do with science fiction. Although many people still are convinced that this is nothing more than science fiction, but hopefully the events of the last 5 or 6 years have proven otherwise. I mean, we're having congressional hearings in Washington about this. We've got a guy at Harvard, Avi Loeb, launching the Galileo project, who's convinced that there was a trespassing surveillance spaceship from interstellar regions that sailed through here several years ago. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't even know if he's 100% convinced of it, but he's a smart guy. He knows a lot about the subject, apparently, and he's setting up his own sort of detective systems to determine, if these things are in fact coming through here or surveilling us or whatever.
Well, something that's interesting is your background is in music journalism. And how did you go from what you were doing before to this?
Well, I started out in music journalism. I covered pop culture here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which, Minnesota has produced one or two names your listeners might be familiar with: Prince and Bob Dylan, for starters.
Sure.
But also quite a few great comedians, including Liz Winstead, who co-founded The Daily Show, and of course, the late, great Louis Anderson, who was a good friend of mine. I've always been interested in space. I was a space geek as a kid. I had pictures of the early astronauts from the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs up on my wall, next to photos of the Beatles and Rolling Stones. And so those were two of my kind of passions growing up, and I've never really given up on either one of them. I covered pop culture for about 12 years here, and then I actually got tired of it. Turned around and did something completely different, went into public relations work, and never really looked back, although I continue to write the occasional music story or pop culture story for whoever will have my services. But yeah, I had a couple early sightings with high school friends out in western North Dakota, where I grew up. So you don't forget about that stuff. You'll go searching for answers, and the Space Pen Club is largely a search for an answer or many answers, really. And now that we're in this sort of seeming disclosure period out in Washington, it's become even more interesting and also more mainstream, which many of us who followed this for all their entire lives have never thought we would see the place we are today.
Well, it had always been something that was kept very secret. Now, places like I'm going to advance and say I'm woefully ignorant on the subject, other than generic everyday knowledge, in the sense that, like, I've heard of Area 51. I've heard of what happened at Roswell, but I mean, there's so much more to it than that. But I have a very basic, non-comprehensive knowledge. Tell me a little bit more about what was so big happening with this disclosure in the government, because as far as we know, up until that point, the stance was no way, no how. How did things change?
Well, a couple of points. One, my book is really written for those folks who don't know a lot about the subject, but I think it's also a good read for people who are down any number of rabbit holes at any particular point in time, who know a lot about the subject. In fact, I was lucky enough to get Dan Ackroyd to write this rousing endorsement for the book. And among the many very nice things he said one of them was that the Space Pen Club was an excellent bibliography on topic, because I do quote a lot of what I think were probably the best sources during my overall story, my search for the truth on this issue. I should also add, I guess at this point, that in the early 90s, I came into an organization called the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, CSETI, run by Dr. Stephen Greer, MD. And I wrote a story about Greer's thing. He's an advocate of close encounters of the fifth kind. That's human-initiated contact with whoever or whatever these objects are. And I could not sell that story anywhere. It was I have to say, in all humility, it was a really good piece. About 20 pages long, double spaced. Early 90s, this topic was kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's been historically marginalized very well by the secrecy forces, I guess I'll say, that control or manage this subject. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, and I think we can attribute that to the December 17th issue of the New York Times, which on its front page exposed a secret Pentagon study that had gone on for 4 or 5 years, funded with government funds, taxpayer monies. Senator Henry Reid from Nevada was instrumental in getting that done. And one of the guys that was running that secret program was a cat named Lou Elizondo, who's now kind of a household name for anybody that's following this as closely. Christopher Mellon, another big player who served under Bush and Clinton administrations. These guys have become kind of the poster children for disclosure, although Dr. Greer, to his credit, was doing disclosure events as far back as 1997 in Washington, and then again in 2001, and then in a couple of weeks he's going to be back in DC to do yet his third disclosure thing with some new witnesses. So it's going to be interesting. I'm thinking about going out to that. Anyway, a long answer to your question was, when I couldn't sell the story about Greer and close encounters of the fifth kind, I said, look, I can probably get you wider exposure than just one magazine article if I come on board as your publicist. So it was off to the races after that. I worked with them for about 5 or 6 years, mostly in a pro bono capacity, meaning you don't get paid. I got my expenses covered, and we had some pretty good adventures. A lot of the stories in the Space Pen Club are based on that period. Not entirely, but a lot, including a trip to Mexico in which we were into the volcano zone, which we were shadowed by a crew from 48 Hours. It made us look like idiots, gringo idiots abroad. And that segment you can probably still find on online somewhere.
You mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It was a special that they had done on the UFO topic, and we were one of 4 segments. But there's a whole chapter devoted to that experience, chapter 8. And if you want to see flying saucers, UFOs, UAP, whatever you want to call them, go to that region of Mexico because there's a lot of activity down there.
And what region is that? You said the volcano region?
It's a volcanic zone, although it's become increasingly dangerous down there right now because Mount Popo, which I think is the second largest volcanic mountain in the world, started to erupt in the last few days, and it's been spewing a lot of ash and boulders and stuff. So it's only 45 minutes southwest, I think, of Mexico City. And Mexico City, is built on a lake bed. So if that volcano really goes to town, there's a good possibility that there could be major earthquakes in Mexico City and surrounding area, including Puebla, which is near where we did our thing with the 48 Hours crew. We actually had an incident where an orangish orb came out of the sky at about 11 o'clock at night. I was the first one to notice it and yelled at the guys to roll film. And they never once mentioned what this was during the segment once they cut it together. Although they used the footage to open our segment, which is like, okay, is that how you're going to play ball? I mean, it was really lousy journalism to begin with. Like, why were we in Mexico to begin with? Well, there's been an ongoing UFO wave in Mexico since the 90s, since there was a total solar eclipse and these objects started appearing all over the place. And then they start subsequently after the eclipse, they would come out during the daylight even. I mean, there's rich history of UAP, UFOs hanging out in Mexico. So I think that chapter is one of my favorite in the book because it covers a lot of territory, and it also talks about the failures of media in general in doing such a horse crap job on reporting on this subject. That said, I'm a little sympathetic to journalists because they don't have any trusted sources they can go to and say, what the hell is it? What's going on here? And that's due in large part to the compartmentalized secrecy that's protected this subject for decades, going back to at least the beginning of the atomic age in the 40s.
You mentioned that it Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, and I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, so I of course remember the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I'm not clear on the differences between the kinds. What are kinds like 1 through 4? You said that kind 5 was when we initiate contact with them.
Yeah.
What are the other kinds?
The fourth kind is, and I think Jacques Vallée, the Frenchman in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Vallée's written, I don't know how many books on this subject. Every book, he comes up with a different thesis as to what these are. And I mean, it's confusing as hell if you've done any reading on it. But the fourth kind is basically interaction. either with ETs or aboard a spaceship. And then third kind, I guess, is just observation, close observation of object and occupants. Second kind, the first and second kind are more just visual um, identification, trace, ground trace evidence. That's more on the first level. So they're sort of built incrementally. And Greer, in all of his wisdom, came up with this contact protocols, as he calls it, to initiate contact using sound, light, and remote viewing, which is a fascinating topic. We could spend 2 hours talking about that.
I
And
actually made a note on that.
yeah, just Google remote viewing. There's been a lot of good books written about that too, including one by John, is it McGonigal? His book is very good. I think it's called Mind Trek.
Well,
But
some of the references as to remote viewing deal with some of the military being involved in stuff like psyops
yeah, well,
and that type of thing.
military has, or discrete branches of the military have used remote viewing to spy on Russians or alleged terrorists. And the Russians had a program too. They probably still do, and apparently they were much better at it than we were. It's a fascinating subject. People still do it today. Ed Dames, for anyone who listens to Coast, he shows up on there about twice a year and talks about um, projects he's been remote viewing on. He gets hired by corporations and also the military to do this. I never know what to believe about Ed because he's got kind of a doomsday thing hanging over him. And
Oh dear.
but fascinating topic, and one that's part of the close encounters of the fifth kind contact methods. And I get into that pretty deep in the book. It's a whole chapter called Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind.
How many of us have had maybe first or second encounters and we just don't know? I mean, it's a busy world out there. There's lots of stuff. It seems like people are talking about this more now. And it seems like, especially with the advent of cellular phones, where they have, I remember to have a camera, you had to have film, you had to have a flash bulb, you had to have all that stuff. Now, of course, everything's self-contained in the camera. So there's a lot of UFO footage. There's a lot of paranormal footage. There's a lot of footage that people have now that we have a camera handy. We can are there more sightings, or has the technology just made it more shareable?
It might be both. And there's going to be a third component to add to that just has seemingly arrived on our doorstep with a thud this spring, and that's artificial intelligence, and
Right.
that's going to wreak havoc with. I don't even want to think of how bad this is going to be. Number one, for the next election cycle, presidential election cycle in 2024. There's going to be a lot of fake stuff floating around that the gullible and the people who like to waste time are going to spend a lot of time wasting looking at all this garbage that AI is creating or collaborating with the people who have too much time on their hands. So, yeah, I mean, cell phone cameras are great. I'm at the point now in my life, and as what I like to say, a professional observer of this topic and also an experiencer of it, that uh, I don't really care about all of that stuff anymore. I don't care about, cool looking videos or indecipherable images that come off of a good camera or a cell phone camera. Um, it's, I kind of feel like I'm done with it. And if we have a real disclosure, which I'm still dubious of, I'll be elated. But I'm ready to move on. I have other things I want to do. I don't want to think about this a lot, and I do think about it a lot. I wrote a whole book about it over a 10-year period. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. there's a lot of stuff that truly is unidentifiable, and then there's a lot of stuff that's, it's, flock of birds or mylar balloons or
Weather balloons was always
Chinese
what I
spy
heard.
balloons.
Right.
I mean, pick your distraction du jour.
You call yourself an experiencer. What was your experience?
Well, those are also detailed pretty deeply in the Space Pen Club. I had a sighting with three other high school friends in Western North Dakota our junior year, and I, obviously had subsequent sightings with Greer's organization, including the one in Mexico I just described. But about the same time I met Steve Greer, there was a lot of weird, can we say shit on this podcast?
We can say shit. We say it all the time.
There was a lot of weird shit going down in my home in South Minneapolis, which is another part of the story. Was this ET? Was this poltergeist? I mean, what was this? Including waking up one morning at 4:03 and seeing 5 little red orbs in the bedroom, and then blacking out after about being awake for 45 seconds, and then having some residual after effects from this experience, which to date, I still don't know what it was. I wish I did. I wish I could say, oh yeah, I used to go around to different UFO conventions with Greer and sometimes without him, and I had always talked to other ufologists from around the world that would be at these events. And if it got to the point where we were just talking personally, I would say, hey, I had this experience once with 5 little red orbs. One guy from Brazil said, oh, those are the gray ETs. They're shapeshifters. I'm going, okay, I'll put that in my tinfoil file. I mean, how can you be so sure? How do you know? I mean, that's the problem with this topic. And, if I sound like I'm frustrated with it, you're probably hearing me correctly.
Well, I realize that it's got to be frustrating. I've worked with paranormal research before, and the advancement of tech, at least in that field, has both enhanced because now people are catching things on film. Because if you just walk up to somebody and say, "You won't believe what I saw," they say, "You're right. It sounds interesting, but I don't believe you. I need proof." So it offers some sort of, credibility to your experience if you have it on film. But also, I think it muddies the water in the sense that, now once you have, it's just like anything else, it's corruptible. Once you have people posting videos of this happening, somebody's going to post a video that they figured out how to rig. And now you have to decipher what was altered and what was not. And then it goes on and on. And there are people that have experiences. I've always been drawn to stories that involve mass experiences where bunches of people see the same thing, because that to me is very credible.
Yeah, and you get that in Mexico. I got down to Mexico City when I went on this excursion with Greer's team, where we were shadowed by the CBS News crew from 48 Hours. And I got there a day early and I had some time to kill. So I hired a cab and drove down to the Zocalo, downtown Mexico City, which there's a lot going on there. There's a beautiful cathedral down there that's built on top of some Aztec ruins. I found pretty interesting in and of itself. But this guy spoke pretty good English, and I spoke some, enough bad Spanish where we could communicate.
Been there.
I started asking him about UFO sightings. He goes, oh yeah, just last week, I was out driving and people were stopped in this one quadrant of the city and all pointing up into the sky, and there's a silver object up there. It's like 1 PM. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that happens in Mexico on a fairly regular basis. And here's the kicker, it's reported in the news. they have a wonderful expression for the UFOs or for whatever these objects are. They call them the ovnis, the unknowns, which always thought the ovnis be a good name for a band, or
It does sound like a great band.
even the unknowns. That said, I forgot my train of thought, but there's a whole chapter on that event.
Mass sightings.
Yeah, mass sightings in Mexico, and the role that media has really failed to play in this. Although they're slowly coming around. I mean, when you have pilots from the Navy going on 60 Minutes telling them about these, what do they call them? These tic tacs.
Oh, right.
They're seeing those on a daily basis, according to one guy.
And
Okay.
if I remember correctly, Tic Tacs are those little bullet shaped. I've seen video of them.
Yeah. Now you can Google them. They come up pretty quickly because that story had a zillion hits. So when you got people on 60 Minutes talking about this stuff, and you got Tucker Carlson, regardless of what you think of his political views, I mean, he did some really good reporting before he got the axe at Fox. And I think all things considered, this should be a nonpartisan issue. It shouldn't be politicized.
No, it would seem that this is sort of like out of that realm. But it's interesting that, like I said, growing up, especially through the Cold War era, that this was all considered like, the government never took a position on it, really, except that nope, nope, nope. They just never, it was all deny, deny, deny.
Well, they did and they
And
didn't, depending on who came out from the military to address it. I mean, I got this great quote from the book here. I got to look at my notes so I get this right. General Twining in 1947, and this was uncovered in a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information document that probably took years to get. Twining in 47 said, "They are not of this world." General Nathan Twining, and stated that the phenomena reported as something real and not visionary or fictitious. And he went on to describe the extreme rates of climb and other characteristics that precisely match the recorded capabilities of the objects, such as the ones in the recently released naval footage from a couple of years ago.
right.
So,
And that was in 1947.
That was in 47. I mean,
Which,
he just came right out and said, this is a phenomena it's not visionary or fictitious. He does, he noticed he doesn't say it's extraterrestrial, but I mean, what are the options at some point?
right. And he's not of this world, I think is key. That's definitely a thing. So that's even now. I know that, I believe, was Roswell 51.
Roswell was
1950.
47.
Oh, so it was right around that same time.
46. Yeah, I think it was right after.
I don't know why I thought it was in the 50s, but so historically, is there and I'm sorry to put you on the spot. What's the earliest? Is there an earliest record of a UFO sighting?
That's a good question too. I mean, talk to some people, they'll tell you, well, it's in the Bible. It's the whole Ezekiel's wheel thing. That was a extraterrestrial craft, and more fundamentalist Christians will probably tell you, no, that was some kind of spiritual manifestation. So I don't know. Chariots of the Gods. I mean, that old book from the, what was it, the 70s, I think. They traced the author of that, Sykin, I think is his name, traced back to the Sumerian civilization thousands of years ago and looked at the symbols on some of their recovered tablets and tried to make a case that these things were interacting with Earth at an early stage.
The Chariots of the Gods by Erich von, I don't know how to say it, Daniken?
Daniken.
Daniken.
I'm thinking
Okay.
of another guy, though, who wrote a similar book. I don't know. It's a nice Friday afternoon in Minnesota. My recall is not as sharp as it should be.
Well, you know, but there are references, and some people have even, I mean, if you were to research this online, there's a lot of material that suggests that going back to ancient times, going back at least to you know, some of the artists and some of the works of art that were created even through the Renaissance, that there's depictions of extraterrestrial concepts.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of spacecraft in some of those select older paintings from different periods, which is curious in and of itself. But then you have a whole nother school of thought that says, no, these things have always been here. They're part of Earth in some fashion. They're like a breakaway civilization.
Hmm.
And, you know, that's just one more viewpoint on it. I touch on that briefly in my book. A good friend of mine, Tom Talene, who researched the 1967 incursion at the Minot Air Force Base, where an object came in, spooked everybody on the ground, and was also being viewed on radar by a plane that was returning to the base. They had him on their radar, and they also had visual contact with it. But this object was huge. It was hovering over this base that has atomic weapons, and it managed to open the lid on one of these missile silos, scrambled the launch codes. I mean, this is serious stuff.
That is serious. I mean, we're talking about, you know, a lot of the people that would report some of these incidents are people that are handling national defense, military defense. They're watching radar screens. They're having these encounters. You know, they see the tic tacs in the air, and you know, there is a question. I think that when you're dealing with that, sort of, you sort of say to yourself, you know, is this a threat to national defense? I think if it was going to be a threat, we'd be done by now. But that's, again, I have kind of a simple view.
Yeah, well, it is a threat in that we can't defend against it, obviously. So it's an outstanding threat. But on the other hand, you know, my buddy Tom, who did all this wonderful reporting and research on the Minot incident, I devote several pages of that in chapter 4 of the Space Pen Club to his Minot research. You know, Minot is only 100 miles from where I grew up. And, you know, he turned up this incredible story that had all these great witnesses. These guys talked to him on the record. Very real, very troubling event. And after all those years now, Tom is convinced that this whole thing it's all our stuff, everything, the whole deal. And that it's been so well managed and it's the secrecy around it has been so effective that these things have managed in this, whoever it is that's part of this, and I don't tend to believe this one way or the other. I just think it's another fascinating story, another, you know, stream of the never-ending river of ufology, polluted and otherwise. I said, Tom, I said, that's harder to buy than the whole ET thing. You know, people coming from interstellar space somehow, leaping through the time-space continuum. I said, that's a much easier sell than what the hell you're talking about.
Well, that would be another question I would have is that are these, I think people get very focused that these sightings, these crafts, and in some cases people have actually felt that they've seen beings, are coming from a where. Could it be possible they're coming from a when?
Oh yeah, I think anything's possible. And in the days where I really give this more thought, I think, all this stuff might be real. They might be interdimensional. They might be from another planet somewhere out in our own galaxy or another. There might be a breakaway civilization. I mean, all these things could coexist simultaneously. Uh, I think our understanding of the universe is pretty much infantile, and we're
I'll
just
agree with that. And I think it's
beginning.
kind of arrogant to assume we're the only quote unquote intelligent life. And I'm going to
And I
use
hope
that
we're
quote.
not, because we don't have a great track record.
Then we're screwed.
The
But
thing that I like, and this is in my book too, there's this great quote from 1927, almost 100 years ago, by a
wow.
British geneticist and evolutionary biologist by the name of JBS Haldane. He says the universe is not only stranger than we suppose, but it's stranger than we can suppose.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that's where I kind of leave this whole discussion. I went, that's my last card on the table. I said, yep, I'm going with that until all of the rest, until the next hand is dealt. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Well, the Space Pen Club also goes into some of the things like the abductions and other oddities like crop circles, the stigmata, and that's a variety of unusual.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter on the whole abduction discussion, and to me, that's the most difficult chapter in the book. It's chapter 3. So if you make it through chapter 3, it's smooth sailing from then on, because chapter 3 looks at the possibility that maybe some of these abductions are staged abductions to pollute the information pool, to create, fear, to pump up the defense budget yet again, to fight these things in space. Hey, they're taking our people at night. They're getting stealing, you know,
Anal
fetuses.
probes. We all know what comes next. Anal
Yeah, I
probes. We're
mean,
all scared of it.
and this is the kind of stuff that's gonna, once this really gets established, if it gets really established in Washington, after all the preliminary questions about, okay, this is real, our military guys have confirmed it, we're having these hearings to find out more, somebody's going to raise the abduction issue, and that's going to shut down, I think that's going to shut down any progress. Like yesterday, it's too big, and people are not going to be prepared for even entertaining notions of what I just said. Like, some of these have been staged by our own military, and a true psyop, a true, what's that other word? Ah,
It's a diversion and a
but
tactic.
it's a diversion and a tactic. Yep.
Well,
And
I've read stories from folks that, and I've seen news clips and things of people who are, and they are otherwise perfectly, they're not, as they're speaking, they're not appearing to have any kind of um mental
psychosis.
affect. Right, yeah, they don't seem delusional, they seem otherwise at baseline. And the thing is that they're very, most of them are quite frightened and traumatized. They do seem very traumatized by this. And I mean, I got news: if somebody wakes me up in the middle of the night and gives me a spontaneous colonoscopy, I'm not going to be too happy about it either. But the thing is that the stories, at least from the sources, appear credible. No, except that they're fantastic, they do appear credible. They're coming from credible people who don't exhibit like they otherwise would be making this up for any kind of reason. And they do seem affected adversely from these experiences. Do you think that actual abductions have taken place, or do you think that might be a tough one?
Again, that's a good question, and if I had the answer to that, I'd be probably working inside government somewhere, some secret program. But uh, I think there are abductions there's a whole book that's been written about the military style abductions, mill labs, as they call them, by a couple. And I'm blanking on their name too, but just Google Mill Labs. That book came out 20 some years ago. I didn't read it because I already knew too much about that. And I said, no, I don't want to know any more about human staged abductions for whatever purpose. I tend to think of an experience like that as more of a close encounter of the fourth kind. And I get into a case with a University of North Dakota professor and his son, who were taken aboard a spacecraft while they were driving to a family reunion in this happened in Wisconsin, and they were en route to, I think, somewhere in Illinois when this happened to them, and they had a very positive experience. And I go into that in the Space Pen Club too, and I think, those are the kinds of stories that I'm interested in. I don't want all this fear junk, like, oh, the aliens took my baby and it's being raised in a mothership somewhere. I mean, I don't have time for that. And I think, I'm going to take the word of a university professor who had just recall of this, without being hypnotized or anything. There's a whole school of abduction research started primarily by Bud Hopkins, the late Bud Hopkins. And then it was kind of picked up by the late John Mack, who is also from Harvard. Mack, there's a wonderful biography of Mack, and gets into all the abduction research he did. And it was written by Ralph Blumenthal, one of the 3 writers that broke the New York Times story back in 2017, December. That's a good read. Read my book and then read the biography of John Mack. And one of the things Mack was thinking about at the time of his death was that maybe these so-called abductions aren't really physical in nature. Maybe they are happening in consciousness. In other words, it's all happening in the mind, and we're interpreting it wrong as being like,
we're traveling somewhere.
You were taken through the roof of your house. Well, maybe you weren't. Maybe you were playing some sort of video in your brain that this other party has managed to figure out at a distance.
Somebody else wrote the script.
They've hacked consciousness, if you will.
Wow.
And they're playing tricks on us. Yet another, how many narratives have we discussed here in the last time? Quite a few. I mean, that's all this stuff's in my book in one size or another.
The book you referenced, Mill Labs, Military Mind Control and Alien Abduction, is by Dr. Helmut Lammer and Marion Lammer.
Yeah, husband and wife team. At some point I'm going to read that book, but I've read enough about it, and I know enough about it. I mean, one of the documents I discuss in chapter 3, which is all about the abduction experience, the alleged abduction experience, was that, we have the tools and technology, we've had them for a long time, to use these microwaves, low-level microwaves, to induce all kinds of mental states, euphoria, godlike experiences, UFO abductions. And it's laid out very clearly. It was a 57-page monogram that a friend of mine back in the early Dr. Greer days at CSETI sent me, another medical doctor out in California. And that blew my mind. I quote that pretty heavily, like, whoa, well, here's some proof that these abductions could be being staged using these electric low frequency waves that target you and manipulate you. I mean, talk about a Manchurian Candidate style scenario. It's right there. The interesting thing about the guy that wrote it, and again, I'm blanking on this guy's name. People are going to think I'm early stage Alzheimer's here or something, dementia. But this guy turned that paper into a 200 some page book, which is now out of print. And apparently he took so much crap for it, and I think probably was threatened by the authorities that manage this subject, that he came out and he disavowed all of his research,
Oh, wow.
all of his conclusions, and said, I didn't mean it. But I think,
It was coerced.
the man doth protest too much.
So has the full disclosure, like if I'm a regular person that maybe sees something or observes something or catches something on film or whatever, if I feel that I mean, is it safe to talk about? Is it obviously there are people that do, I mean, I hate making movie references to fiction, but the thing is to some degree, some fiction seems to be rooted in experience and fact, and then people take the story to another place. But is there a squelch factor to people who get a little too close to the truth still, even with all the disclosure?
Uh, I'm sure there is. I think Dr. Greer would tell you that there is, and he would probably name names of people who have been killed.
Wow. See, that's terrifying, because then you say, well, how can we talk about this if it's going to put someone in jeopardy?
Yeah, well,
How can I say what I saw?
I don't think just seeing is going to get you in trouble like that. But when you start exposing the secrecy and the reasons for the secrecy, and then you're treading on
Thin ice.
shaky ground.
Yeah.
And I don't have any proof to back up Greer's statements. I haven't seen him in about 25 years. If I go to Washington in a couple of weeks, be the first time I've seen him since the late 90s. But
I mean, culturally though, it's known because of fictitious depictions of quote unquote men in black. I've heard witnesses talk about everyone keeps bringing up black helicopters.
yeah,
Those come up a lot. But in any case, there is a healthy paranoia about getting too close to the truth, exposing something you shouldn't, or stumbling into an area that you shouldn't. Obviously, now Area 51 is still closed, and I know you can't get anywhere near it, and no one knows what's in there allegedly, and that type of thing. Has there been any updates on that, or is it still a lockdown? Nobody knows what goes on there.
you read a lot of stuff about what people think's happening there. I mean, I think it was established to test experimental aircraft. Certainly, if we back engineered some downed spaceships, then those would definitely be in the experimental stage.
Sure. Well, I have one.
I don't know what goes on there.
Sorry. I have one. I have one last question for you. You mentioned experimental aircraft, and that is something that is always in development, because especially now that the space race is kind of, it's not, after the shutdown. Now we're starting to get a little, now civilians are entering the space race, and all of that. Is there a correlation between sightings and UFO sightings in a certain area or at a certain time that might correlate to development of something like, like the stealth bomber? The stealth bomber, before we knew what it was, if you happen to be casually watering your garden and you saw that thing, you're going to run in the house and think you saw a UFO.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of correlation that where people are reporting incidents round about the time when they are actually testing and experimenting, and it is legit something that we've originated here through either a military build or something?
Well, I know the Aurora spacecraft, which I think is still classified. I think that's been seen quite a bit and reported. The thing that's being reported right now in large numbers, not so much anymore, because the news world is done a good job of pointing out to people, like, these many points of light they see traveling in unison across the night sky. That's not the mothership, dude. Those are Elon Musk Starlight satellite systems.
Well, now there's so much up that you bring up an excellent point. There's so much up that we have GPS satellites up there. We have everything, but Skylab is still up there. There's all this. There's stuff up there now.
Yeah,
Whereas
a lot of space junk, as Devo used
yeah,
to sing about. I wrote there's another thing on the spacepenclub.com. I have an ongoing blog there that I try to pay attention to at least once a month, although I think I've fallen behind again. But I did write a blog about space junk and some different impacts of, what are people seeing and what aren't people seeing. And
right.
so, yeah, the other thing is, in terms of technology advancement and being mistaken for UFOs or ET spacecraft or UAP, these black triangles have been spotted for the last several decades all over the place. Greer was in Mexico with one of his teams. I wasn't on this particular mission, but they encountered a huge triangle 2 o'clock in the morning in the volcanic zone. And they were pretty much convinced it was not from this world, but there are other people that tell you, that's probably a super stealth craft developed right here in, America and or Britain.
Stealth bomber is kind of a big black triangle.
Yeah, this is a little more defined, though, a true triangle. But
oh, I see.
I don't know. I mean, it's the biggest puzzle I've ever encountered.
And you don't have an answer yet? Have you not solved the Rubik's Cube yet?
No, and I joke in the book that one of the reasons I wrote this book was to say farewell to ufology.
And here you are on the podcast.
Here I am on a podcast, and I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago called UFO Disclosure run by I think his name's Albert Barrows, and I shared an experience that I had 2 months prior to when this book published that I have never written about, and that was the first time I talked about it. I don't know if I want to go into it here and take away Albert's scoop, but
well, folks can go. You mentioned his podcast. If they want to hear the story, they can. I'm very much in promoting other podcasters. So if folks want to hear,
it's right at the end of the podcast, about 45 minutes long. So it'd be in the last 5 to 8 minutes of that. But I've had weird stuff in my whole life. I'm a pretty down to earth guy. I'm a so-called Capricorn. We're kind of grounded goats. We work hard and we're generally disciplined. We don't have
my mom's a Capricorn. You're spot on so far.
We don't have time for these indulgences, but
no,
I've had weird experiences my whole life, and I put them all into this book, and hopefully that I could close the chapter, but I don't think the chapter is going to be closed anytime soon.
No, we're not going to let you do that. But folks, you definitely need to read the Space Pen Club, and you can go to the spacepenclub.com and click the Amazon link and buy it direct from Amazon. And what's next for you?
I'm working on a book about Bob Dylan.
Oh, wonderful.
I started it last spring, and then I got really busy with work and also promoting this book. But I had some good Bob Dylan adventures, and it's like, well, does the world need another Dylan book? Did the world need another book about UFOs? I don't know. But I think I'm going to have some interesting things to say about him. I interviewed him in '83 when Infidels came out, right after his conversion. It's the first interview he had done. It was pretty revealing. And I went on the Never Ending Tour in 91 for a week, swing through the Midwest. And then I had some social interaction with him. He's got a place right outside of Minneapolis, west of town. And I spent quite a bit of time with a friend of his, Larry Keegan, who's one of Bob's lifelong friends since they were teenagers. And so I got a lot of Bobby stories to tell, and also maybe hopefully shed some light into his whole artistic universe that he's given us.
Well, that's going to be a fascinating read. I'm always interested in the artistic process and how people get inspired, where they come from, and what makes them tick. Well, folks, once again, thank you so much, Martin, for joining us. And for all of you listening, we want to thank you. And remember to hit subscribe for wherever you listen to podcasts. So once again, thanks to Martin Keller. Go to the spacepenclub.com and click to buy his book. And remember, folks, stay kooky out there. Thank you for listening to Macabre World. You can find us on the web at www.darkerartsstudio.com.